Greetings, everyone, from Old Town Alexandria. My name is Lester Jones, Chief Economist for the National Beer Wholesalers Association. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I am sorely disappointed that I did not get to travel to North Dakota for your annual meeting at the Canad Inn, but here we are virtually to walk you through the industry and what we see has happened since the last time we met. So let me just say, last time we were together, 10 years of economic expansion, beer industry wasn't doing so well, it was struggling a little bit, but lots have changed, obviously. What we see in 2018 to 2019, if you remember, we weren't looking at an industry that was growing. But what actually happened in 2019 is the industry did relatively well at adding volume. We added almost 1 million barrels to just the beer industry, as you can see on the chart. We had about 1 million barrels of domestic packaged beer, brew pub beer, which is kind of that beer that they serve direct to consumers in tap rooms and brew pubs around the country. And then imported beers obviously grew about 1.6%. Overall, about a half a point of industry growth for 1 million barrels. You know, I expand the industry too, as you know. I look down to the domestic cider, the imported cider, and then kind of a catch-all account that is, we call it not elsewhere identified or classified, NESOI. And this part of the industry grew tremendously, almost 64% off of a small base. But what it actually did is all in for an expanded industry. The beer industry managed to add almost 0.6 or 1.2 million extra barrels to the industry. And that was good and not too surprising. But remember, we're competing. We're competing for occasions, for share of mind, for share of stomach with consumers. And when you look at the beer, cider, wine, and spirits industry, the total alcohol beverage market, that 2.5 gallons that we discussed last year is still kind of there. You can see there at the end for 2019, it's a little bit higher. Beer's share has obviously continued to decline, and liquor's share has continued to grow. But for the most part, we're pretty steady at 2.5 gallons. You know, and when you take that vertical axis that I just showed you, that went from 0 to 2.5, and you zoom right in, as economists and statisticians like to do when we lie with the axis, you can see that I got 2.4 to 2.59 now. And what you all of a sudden start to see is that there is a little bit of measurable impact from the business cycle on total alcohol consumption. You can 2010, 2011 was a down year for the U.S. in terms of an economic recession, and consumption fell a little bit. But it fell by a very small amount, maybe 1 drink a month at best per person. And then as we came out of our last economic recession in 2010, 2011, the industry kind of grew, and we added an extra drink because the good times were here and people had a little bit more money and the industry was growing a little bit. But once we dropped again, it fell down again in 2008 and 2009. A little stuttered a bit, and then we started growing again. And that was at 10 years of economic expansion we saw from 2010 to 2019. Obviously, we're in a big economic recession in 2020, but the reality is that we've done a lot of economic stimulus. We spent trillions of dollars in expanded unemployment benefits and economic stimulus payments and payroll protection programs, and all that money kind of flows into the market in 2020. So I'm still expecting 2020, in terms of total alcohol consumption, to kind of land where it did in 2019, probably around flat. We will hit that 2.6 gallons of total ethanol consumption per person. You know, in this methodology, as I showed you last year, it held true in 2019. Texas and Department of Revenue for Colorado both showed that even though there is regional differences in how much alcohol people consume, that 2.5 gallons still plays out. In a place like Texas, pretty much right at the national average. Colorado, with a much younger, more youthful population, running about 3 gallons. And of course, if I did Utah in here, it would probably be down around 2 gallons per person. So it's varied across the country, but once again, that methodology or that idea that we are consistent, reliable consumers of alcohol hold true both at the national level and at the state level. And even if you look at things like other countries, when you go over to the United Kingdom, you can get the same data, and what you find is on a per capita level, you go from 2.5 gallons in 2010, and you swing all the way over to 2019. Even though there is a little dip there and a little bit of drop down in 2014 and 2015, it still averages about the same. Once again, as in the United States, in the individual states, and in the United Kingdom, relatively consistent predictable consumption. And there's some, Canada here plays out as well. Now, it's a little different than what you see in the United States and United Kingdom. You went from 2.6 gallons down to 2.4 gallons consistently over that 10-year, 11-year period. But what we don't have in the United States and the UK is in Canada, what they adopted was an index to inflation alcohol excise tax, which means is every year they look at what the inflation is and then they jack up the excise tax to meet it. So you've had this consistently rising alcohol excise tax in Canada over time, and they're doing a good job of fighting it, but they haven't won that fight yet. So just take a note on how predictable consumption is in the US, around the States, and also in some of the international markets. And it's not just volume that's consistent. What's also consistent is the share of expenditures that go to alcohol. So for every dollar you make, there's a certain percentage of expenditures that go to alcohol. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics does a consumer expenditure survey. And in this consumer expenditure survey, every year they survey households and ask them to tell them how much money they spent on alcohol. And what it comes down to is about 0.9 or 1% of people's total expenditures go to alcohol. And again, it's relatively consistent here. You see 2000 to 2019, and you see a relatively consistent, stable amount of expenditures that go to alcohol. And expenditures are really important, in my opinion, because that is what drives supply and demand for alcohol. And if you look at this table real quickly, what you'll see, remember I shared this data with you for the 2017 data. We have 2 more years of data that I've added to it from the last time we met. But once again, focus in on that age 45 to 54 category. That's $77,000 a year. It's a significant amount of total expenditures that people report on everything from food to gas to shelter to rent to health insurance to books to entertainment. All the things they spend comes down to this survey. And age 45 to 54 it's where you kind of max out or maximize your expenditures. And it makes sense because that's when your career is at its height and that's when you're making your most money. And you're basically at the height of your careers. So pay attention to this slide, think about it a little bit, and think about how the economy and the demographics are changing over time. When I take that same data and I look at just the alcohol beverage expenditures, this is what you get, 2010 to 2019, same kind of layout that I just did, but take a note, age 45 to 54, $722, right? So spending 1% of that $77,000. So that is where the big prize is in terms of consumer expenditures and people's demand for alcohol. Interesting to note, I do like that age 75 there too as well, 7% CAGR. So that CAGR is a compound annual growth rate. It's 7.1% in this slide right here, meaning every year since 2010, alcohol expenditures in households headed by age 75 and older have grown by 7%. The average there is 3.9%, so almost twice as fast. But keep in mind that over the same period of 2010 to 2019, what we saw is so many more younger people staying at home with their adults, so many more young adults living at home with their elder parents. So this is not necessarily 75-year-old age head of households having a big party. This is also indicative of older households having their younger children live at home longer, and that alcohol expenditures driving through this survey as well. But what's important to really note here is that when you look at the age structure of the US economy, you have a distribution of population that looks like this chart here. I have the single groups on the horizontal axis and the number of people in each age group growing up the vertical axis. And what you see is if you look at that 0 mark, there's about 3.7 million people in this country between the ages of 0 and 1. Follow that chart on up towards you, that 26, 27, that's kind of the height of the millennial population right now. And think back to those charts that I just gave you, right? So in that green area, here's the opportunity for the beer industry and for the alcohol beverage industry in general and for you guys as well, who are going to be suppliers to this industry, think about this. Right now, the bulk of that population in that younger consumers are sitting in this 25 to 34-year-old age category. They're spending about $500 a year on alcohol beverage. What's going to happen is they're going to age. We can't stop that, right? And as they age, they're going to have new careers, they're going to earn more money, and their alcohol expenditures are going to simply grow. So as you work through the years, in the next 10 years, you're going to see alcohol expenditures grow for this age group, and then in the following 10 years. So by the time we get to 2030, you're going to have a significantly larger, more profitable, more dynamic alcohol beverage market than probably we've ever seen before. Now you can see the red bar there. That is obviously a threat. We have fewer new legal drinking age consumers coming into the market every year, and that is a problem, and it is a threat. But we also have this opportunity of an expanding market on the back end as millennials age into their careers and earn more money. So as in every market, you always have your threats and your opportunity. This is one of the big ones that are facing the alcohol beverage industry today. So think about this. We also have all this opportunity for growth, but there are a lot of policy changes, fiscal and health policy related challenges that are coming. We know the USDA came out with a limit on how many alcohol beverage drinks a person should have every day, and they reduced it from 2 to 1 for men. That was a big policy fight at the USDA, at the dietary guidelines. We're working on that every day. We've seen some warning signs from Alcohol Justice and some other public health advocates that say that there should be cancer labelings on alcohol beverages. So how that fight plays out over the next years is going to be very important. And we're also on the face of, of an economic recession, a recession that is going to leave many state and local governments in a fiscal mess, basically, having seen large-scale unemployment and lots of loss in hotel and hospitality and leisure taxes around the country. So those are going to probably lead to more excise tax fights in your state that we'll have to address and pay attention to. And finally, I mean, this is not just the U.S., this is a global problem. The World Health Organization has looked at some of the health consequences of alcohol beverages, and they are ramping up their efforts to tamp down alcohol consumption. So if I just flip back to this chart and you think about where we're headed, there are threats and there are opportunities. All of these things come together in the advocacy that the industry needs to do to move forward. Year to date, so the beer industry year to date, I showed you the 2018, 2019. So things are tough in the US beer industry. Don't believe the news that everyone's enjoying and selling more beer. The reality is for the beer industry, we're down. I have it here 2.2% through September. You can see the big hit is in that tax determined. Those are brew pubs, those are tap rooms. That's unpackaged beer that's said directly to consumer. It's down almost it's decimated here, 1.8 million barrels that have been lost in the industry. Once upon a time, this was almost 2 share of the US beer industry. Today, it's less than half. It has meant that the tons of beer has just simply vanished from the marketplace. We couldn't get it all into bottles and cans. We've known there's a shortage of aluminum cans in the industry, and that's been driven by the fact that all the beer that was previously put into draft has now flowed into packaged bottles and cans, which has put a really big constraint on the supply chain. Further down here, you can kind of see as I work down through the table, you can see the expanded industry is off 2.3 million barrels, 1.5%. How this plays out is going to be interesting. Take a look at that imported Prairie meat and NESOI account, 293% up. Seltzers have come in through this country from Canada and Mexico and around Europe that are basically not quantified into a malt beverage category or a cider category. They're 1.4, almost 1.5 million barrels additional of product that just isn't in that malt beverage category. So once again, more threat to the beer-centric or the malt beverage-based category of beer. So domestic volumes, like I said, this is domestic malt beverage volumes. You can see on the table there, May was just a huge hit. When we shut down in March and April for COVID, we closed our event spaces, we closed our concert venues, we saw March Madness, opening day, we saw so many stadium, large crowd events just vanish from the beer industry, as well as tap rooms and brew pubs that were shut down as well. And this just took 10% of the industry, which is typically in draft form, and just limited its access to the market. And at the same time, 18% of the US beer industry is basically in the on-premise. And in that on-premise, with reduced capacities, closures, and limited hours, that further constricted the beer market. And then actually with fewer channels of trade and fewer beer occasions, we've just seen a radical shift in consumption for beer around the country, resulting in this significant loss of beer volumes. Don't get me wrong, we're climbing our way out of this. We're in September now. With this data, we need to get October, November, December data, 3 more months of, we may get closer to 1% or to flat. It all depends on a lot of the supply chain and how quickly we can get the beer that used to be in draft shifted into bottles and cans, get it out into the marketplace. We did see a lot of out of stocks in the industry in 2020 over the summer, and beer distributors' inventories are very low. And at this time, at the same time, the beer distributors are going to seek to rebuild those inventories back to a normal level that they're comfortable with, so that if we do get a pantry rush in the first quarter of the year, the beer is there to feed it into retailers, so that we don't see a lot of out of stocks and empty grocery store shelves around the country. So we may actually end up pretty close to zero for 2020, which might, despite COVID and the pandemic, well, kind of the beer industry in total will look a lot like it has over the last 10 years, which will be an interesting outcome. The Beer Purchasers Index at the MBWA, we survey beer distributors. Every month we ask them if they're ordering more beer. We've seen a consistent pattern over the last 6 months of beer distributors ordering more beer from their suppliers, a good sign as they attempt to rebuild their inventories at their warehouses and keep enough stock on hand to weather through a winter that may see more pantry rushes, or maybe see more people staying at home and consuming more packaged beer and less draft beer. And across the board, you can see here, imports, crafts, premium lights, premium regulars, FMBs, and ciders are all significantly higher than they were in 2019. Below premiums is kind of that sub-premium world, is not above 50 anymore. It was where it used to be back in the summer. So a little bit of sense of returning to normal in terms of beer orders for distributors. So the pulse of the industry, I use this chart to show people the actual pulse of the US beer industry by week. It's indexed to 100, and what that means is 100 is the average across an entire 52 weeks, average case volume that beer distributors sell into retail. So at any given point in time across the year, you can measure to the average, and you can see just how much more demand there is in that particular week. Week 12, pantry rush, that big red jump that you see taking it up to 40 means we are 40% above average weekly volumes trying to get beer into retail to meet consumers' needs. But for the most part, the rest of the time period for the year pretty much played out as expected. We had a pretty strong Memorial Day, a pretty strong 4th of July, even though we shifted between 2 weekends into one. There was a little bit of a Memorial Day flop. It wasn't as strong as we expected, but it's still following the same pattern. And even if you see that red line play out in the last week's 30, the week's 44, pretty much played out as it did last year. So the beer market has a little sense of stability and predictability in it still, despite a lot of the trauma that it endured in the first part of the year from the on-premise shutdowns due to COVID. The keg market is devastated right now. This chart shows you an index of just keg beer sold into retail. And you can see the big drop, and it bounces around there as all those on-premise accounts were closed for the summer, for the early parts of the spring. And then the first part of the year, it took off. It started growing. But then we hit that 4th of July where we had an outburst in COVID and things slowed back down again. And now we're in this period of small, gradual increases, but once again, we're back at a resurgence in COVID cases, and you can see how in the last 2 or 3 weeks, things have flattened back out. So like I tell people all the time, the beer market is a great coincidental indicator to the US beer market. Take a peek at this. This is a index of economic activity. And you can see this nice gradual swoosh, you can see the drop, and then you can see the recovery, and then you can see the drop off again. This is an economic indicator that takes account of foot traffic, freight traffic, transportation, open table reservations, mobility data from cell phones, employment and unemployment data. And it's a giant index of all of this economic activity for the US economy. I'm going to switch back real quick and show you that red line for the keg volume. Once again, this is draft beer sold into on-premise retail. It looks just like this Jeffries Index of Economic Indicators. It mirrors the US economy. So if you ever want to know what's happening in the US economy, just take a peek at the US beer market. It'll give you a good sign or a good signal of what's happening. And you can see here in this last couple of weeks of early November, things have slowed down again as cases have broken back out. And as such, we've seen the keg market slow down as well. So, as we watch the US beer market recover, what we're going to see basically is all eyes focused on the on-premise channels. Right off the bat, what I've done here is I've looked at all the channels of trade for beer, and you can see that there's all these different places that people buy beer. And I've took how much beer they bought in 2019 versus how much they bought in 2020. And compared those total volumes for the two. And right off the bat, you can see that golf clubs and country clubs, outdoor venues that are typically private, are more than almost 90% recovered volumes year over year. And once again, this is an outdoor venue. This is a place where people have a little bit more privacy. That's not so much as restricted. Private clubs, obviously, second on that list. And restaurants, bars, and taverns and casinos fall down at about 60% of recovery. But once again, this is the idea that we have to recover all of these channels for beer to start growing and succeeding again. And these are specifically high-indexed keg markets, draft beer markets that require a lot of work to bring back. Quick look at packaging. Once again, remember, what I've done here is I've taken every week, I've broken it down into a pre-COVID world, kind of the height of the COVID pandemic in early spring, weeks 12 through 21, and then kind of this recovery period, weeks 22 through 44. And what you see is early and before COVID, the beer industry was nicely split between bottles and cans and drafts, pretty much the way it was in 2019 and 2018. Once COVID hit, we lost all of that on-premise. We lost all of that keg market. And you can see how the blue bars, the blue area virtually vanishes, and everything goes into either cans or bottles. So two out of every 3 beers that were consumed during COVID came in a can. Right? And then as we kind of came out of that period, what we started seeing was drafts slowly starting to come back. And as drafts came back, the shares started to switch. But we're back down to cans being about 64%, 3% of draft. We have a long way to go to get back to normal, guys. This is going to be easily second quarter of 2020 before we start seeing a return to what we've had in those weeks of 1 through 11. And this is a recession. This is a hospitality recession. This is something that we've never seen before. If you remember from prior presentations when we talked about what causes economic recessions and economic depressions, it's been oil, it's been housing, it's been a financial crisis. There's been all kinds of other reasons. We've never really had a hospitality-driven recession driven by policies that shut people away from going out, traveling, and enjoying hospitality. And as you can see in this index, that is the industry that's taken the biggest brunt of the unemployment forces in the current economy. This is through November. We have a long way to go to get this industry back up. And this is an industry that is inexplicably intertwined with the beer industry. They depend on each other for their success. How we grow this and repair this industry will be incredibly important for the next 6 months to go. And just to close off real quick, you can't have a talk about beer without talking about hard seltzers. Hard seltzers have exploded into the marketplace. Some of them are malt-based. Some of them are just water and sugar-based. Some of them are distilled spirits based, so they're just a rainwater in Texas, for example, is basically a seltzer with a little bit of Texas vodka versus the Mike's Hard Lemonade, which is a flavored malt beverage based. Some are just are just basically water and fermented sugar. So it's really hard to define this segment into any specific category of alcohol beverages, whether it's beer, wine, or spirits. For this part, I'm looking at what appears on beer distributors' trucks. I got an orange line, which is 2019. I got a red line, which is 2020. You can see it's significantly higher. A couple things to point out on this chart is that the drop-off in the later weeks of 2020 have been a lot steeper than they were in 2019. So I think we kind of really put a lot of seltzers out there earlier in the first half of the year. The market kind of got saturated with it. Once we caught up with those out of stocks, things fell off pretty intensely in the last couple of weeks. How we play it out for the rest of the year will depend on what kind of share the industry does actually have. But what I can tell you for now, seltzers are about a 7% share of the US marketplace, okay? They did peak in early June and July. They got to almost 9%. Once again, this is defined as a beer. It doesn't include any of the distilled spirits seltzers that are out there, that are spirits-based seltzers. But for the beer-specific seltzers, we got up to about 9%, almost 9%. We fell off dramatically through October, September, November. We're down around 7%. This table here will show you some of the shares across the major brands. You can see White Claw and Truly and Bud Light are still an 80 share player year to date. 10 points below where they were in January, but for the most part, they're still maintaining their dominance in the marketplace. And you're hearing about every day, another supplier or another brewer or another distiller is putting out a new seltzer. I mean, this is a tough market, and we will probably see a 10 share easily by first quarter of next year. How long it can hold will be a good test to the staying power of this brand new segment to the alcohol beverage market. So let me just wrap it up here. 2020 is going to end up looking a lot like 2019, I think. The only difference here is we're going to have different people drinking different beers in different places, which is the same theme I've been talking to you guys about for years. The alcohol beverage market has been about the innovation and the evolution of the American consumer looking for different drinks in different places. COVID has just sped that up in such a way. We will still see the same level of total consumption. It's just going to be very different across the board. And the economics and the demographics are going to continue to shape the beer market in years ahead. Innovation is not going away. Suppliers are going to continue to look for new products to fight for consumers' awareness and their share of wallet. We'll see new channels of retail trade, especially in the e-commerce, start to grow in the wake of COVID and as a repair. And this hospitality, this leisure and hospitality recession, something that we've never seen in the economic history of the United States, will continue into 2021. We'll have lots of economic stimulus to try to rebuild this economy and work things forward. So once again, guys, I'd like to say thank you for taking the time to listen. Cheers from Old Town Alexandria and the National Beers Wholesalers Association. Thank you.